look back at what had been learned and also to look forward to how lessons could be applied. And hence we have Reimagining Learning After the Pandemic Experience. And we're bringing together today, and thank you to everybody who's offered to present, that multiplicity of experiences and a multiplicity of voices who may not be presenting but can be sharing throughout the day on the things that have worked, things that haven't worked, and perhaps, as was mentioned also in that chat, about learning how we can shape the new landscape based on experiments that we never in our wildest dreams thought we'd have the opportunity to actually carry out in such a condensed space of time. And the talks and that will bring that together. So I would like to wish everybody who's presenting the best of luck. And I'd ask us all to remember on this day our colleagues in Ukraine, who instead of being in classrooms are worried about their classrooms being bombed, their students are themselves being killed, and that they are part of that collegiate of teachers that we are honoured to be part of. Our first speaker, our keynote speaker, I'm delighted to say, is one of our own, Katie Molloy, who's been on the executive of CESI for a good number of years and is the secretary. But that's her extra job. Katie works with an organisation called CELT, which is the Centre for Excellence in Learning and Teaching based in Galway. She herself is a second level teacher by experience, both here in Ireland and the US in the subject of English. And she is very passionate about the possibilities that technology has to enhance the whole teaching and learning experience. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Katie, who I'm really, really looking forward to her presentation today. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks so much, Adrienne. I'm just going to get myself organized here for a second and share some slides. Okay, my regular slides showing there for everyone? Mm-hmm. Perfect. Listen, folks, thanks so much for the introduction and the invite. That obviously I do share a slightly different hat from time to time in my work in CESI, but I suppose I'm here today to talk a little bit about my day job and some reflections from across the pandemic. Because as Adrienne has just said, you know, we're 2 years into this, and I think, frankly, an awful lot has been learned. But what I wanted to do, I vacillated on this talk multiple times about where I would go with it in terms of themes. And I went back to the conference theme, and frankly, I wanted to talk about my own journey with CESI, because I think these, you know, tracing our paths and tracing kind of our reflecting on those paths is really, really useful. And for me, specifically, it's been a 10-year journey at this stage. So I just wanted to go back in time a little bit before we actually think about the future and get to reflecting on that inclusive and flexible future that I hope to highlight with some of my project work here today. So this was my classroom 10 years ago in St. Joseph's College in Summerhill. It doesn't look very fancy. I was hired as an English teacher for a whole year from August to August. I was absolutely delighted with myself. It wasn't a maternity leave cover. It was my classroom. It was my students. You can see there's not really any technology bar, a little computer way off in the corner that wasn't networked to anything. I didn't have a projector. There's a computer room in that door across the hallway. The computers were probably from the 90s at that stage. They weren't very usable, but you know, nonetheless, I was putting myself out there on Twitter. I was learning from other folks, joining the CESI list, using Edmodo to collaborate with students and provide feedback, and going on Blogger and Blogspot to write with my students. And I was loving it because frankly, you know, it was a space where I could finally relax a little bit, that I had moved home from the States a couple of years before. I hadn't found any steady work. And I was excited to kind of grapple with teaching again. So 10 years ago, I wandered into the Portlaoise Heritage Hotel for the CESI Teach Me on the 24th of February. And this is an entirely other talk. I won't go into the entire history of my time at CESI, but for me, honestly, I was already using the technology, and I'd already been, frankly, very passionate about the technology, but I was missing a sense of community. I had missed that sense of community. And a real focus on CPD in the States. We were supported to attend CPD regularly. We were funded to, in fact, we were mandated to. And I hadn't really found that since I had moved home. But I walked into that room, and I'm sure there's a lot of folks here that remember that night, and there's some familiar faces there. And it was buzzing. It was like walking into the afters of a wedding. And I said, is this a teacher's conference? I was a little bit late. The room was packed. There was nowhere to sit. But when I started planning this talk, I thought about this conference specifically and thought about those 10 years, because frankly, so many people I met there and engaged with in this community throughout those 10 years, frankly, have shaped my career. And it's, you know, it's such an interesting thing to talk about a Saturday or just a random event we go to. And, you know, I can't do enough justice to throw, you know, enough photos into one slide. But to be honest, this community has just been so rich. So, you know, I know it's a slightly different format the last 2 years in the online space, but I would encourage folks to think about this community and to really avail of the community. So in 2015, I got a job as a learning technologist at NUI Galway. And in 2019, I was lucky enough to secure a place as the NUI Galway project lead on this Enhancing Digital Teaching and Learning project. So in the summer of 2019, I started working with this larger project team that it's funded through the Irish Universities Association. And what was interesting, I suppose, about this is working with the IUA institutions being the 7 universities. We started working and a team started building that we were all kind of hired at different times. We had their student partners brought in, student interns. And what the project aimed to do was to focus on digital attributes and the educational experiences of students to improve that experience in higher ed for students. But in order to do that, what we had to do was look at mainstreaming digital teaching and learning practices in the Irish universities by specifically addressing professional development. So a lot of us as learning technologists or academic developers or lecturers, there's a variety of folks on the project team, but what it did was kind of enable us to look at a snapshot of what's happening across the country. So what we established in those early days, because this is going to become relevant with the pivot to online learning, we had a bit of space in the early days back in 2019 to really focus on what the core of the project was. So during the first year, we really developed that ethos that really, you know, folks, for most part, the staff we were supporting, were not starting from zero, that they had some digital skills, that they were trying new things. For the most part, you know, digital technologies were fairly mainstreamed. We developed specifically a pedagogy first approach that we really wanted to focus on the pedagogy rather than the tech. We wanted to bring in students as partners, which we did. And we also had a bit of a discipline focus to work with teams and program teams and to kind of support people in collaborating with each other from our role in staff development. So what informed some of this work, and this ties back in, I suppose, to Deirdre Hodson's keynote from last year, and you'll see some work around this kind of thing from Conor Galvin and Roisin Beaver later. The DigComp Edu framework, or the European framework for the digital competence of educators, that we adopted this really early in the project in order to map what was being offered at our institutions, to look at what was available to staff in terms of their own learning, which the different areas. So we focused in the different institutions in a wide variety of different ways. For me, I looked at Area 2 digital resources, and I supported staff to work on open educational resources and created interactive multimedia and the kinds of learning artifacts that I suppose would become very important after the pivot. But I noticed specifically in terms of my own work that we weren't doing an awful lot around Area 5, around empowering learners, so that we could potentially offer more support to staff around very important areas like accessibility and inclusion and engaging learners. So this was pretty much the premise, I suppose, for a lot of the work we were doing, that we were mapping anything that we were doing to it, that it's become a core part of this project. And there are self-reflection tools obviously available out there that, you know, any program team or any teacher can avail of this. So in the early days, before COVID, we had those pilot groups. Like I had said, I was working with numbers of staff to develop materials. Colleagues in DC were working on assessment, that we were working in quite small cohorts before anything really changed. And we also launched a webinar series, a mailing list. We were trying to establish community under the hashtag IUADigit. What we were cognizant of is there are many existing communities. There's EdChat, there's organizations like ALT and ILTA, the FemEdTech network, a wonderfully collaborative network, things like Equity Unbound, Virtually Connecting, but also the likes of CESI, because CESI has been doing the work of a mailing list, of series of CPD events, absolutely all along. And we also did some mapping of our digital skills, like I had said earlier. So we were building a bit of momentum. But you can see some of those kind of timeline elements here that we started in 18. Through the summer of 19, we started to hire folks. We had our big launch of this project, talking about timing and shutdowns in November of 2019. So we launched the project officially at the World Conference for Online Learning. And then we settled in and we were meeting and things were fine, and there was slow momentum building. And then March 12th, 2020 happened. So the announcement was made. Things were uncertain, the same as it was for everyone across the sectors here. But we had a funded digital teaching and learning project in the middle of a pandemic when learning was moving online. So what did we do? What can you do to respond to this? So a lot of the chat was actually really interesting just before the conference, because what did happen was we were able to work far more flexibly as a team working online. That it brought us much closer together. If you can imagine folks from 7 institutions trying to find time to meet. Physically, we were trying to meet up in the IUA, up in Dublin. It was difficult. So because we moved to online and because we had a task to now actually respond to online learning, we were able to work really closely together. And we developed this EDTL approach to planning for remote teaching during this period. And it's a simple infographic, but we actually labored over these areas quite intensely as a project team, because we wanted to figure out what our ethos was for a more flexible and inclusive and engaging learning experience, that students weren't just sitting and watching Zooms or watching recordings. So at the core, we placed our students. We were very happy to place students at the center of it, that who are they? Who are you trying to engage? But then we looked at kind of the other factors as what are students doing during that period? That how are you communicating? How are you engaging them? What kind of content are they working with? So some of the work we'd already been doing could feed into that, working with interactive multimedia and creating more engaging digital content and digital artifacts, but also this element of what worked and what didn't. And that's still a conversation that's happening in the chat there this morning, which is absolutely wonderful. So we developed this, and what we essentially did behind each of these pillars was we curated open resources, we created resources, and we tried to respond to support and empathize with the busy staff that were trying to implement these things. And that conversation has already come up around folks just being busy and overwhelmed and working beyond their hours. And that's great to hear that kind of in the conference chat before starting, because we were so cognizant of what staff are going through and what students are going through. So we adopted a couple of different design approaches within the project. We had been working with these elements, but we also were supporting staff to start doing it themselves. So we have 3 different approaches here outlined. That we have just an image here, the learning type cards, that this is from the ABC Learning Design Framework. And we had been offering staff, training around just maybe redesigning elements of their teaching and learning, how to make learning more engaging in that online space rather than things being purely acquisition focused, that giving students space and using the digital tools appropriately to collaborate and discuss and to produce knowledge. So, and we actually did a lot of our own work using that design approach. So I've actually posted all these up on the conference website. All these resources are available, just to mention. We also really focused on open educational resources, that everything produced by the project has a Creative Commons license. We curated and reused as much open material as we could find, and we tried to support staff to do the same. But one of the focuses that I was originally intending to talk about in this talk was universal design for learning. And that tying back into Area 5 on the DigCom framework around inclusion and accessibility, we did do a lot of work around that trying to not only model for staff how to do that, but just simple tools for engaging students in a variety of different ways, especially with digital content. And part of that work actually goes into the next step is how did we support staff? That it's one thing to kind of create resources and say, here you go, everyone, that this is stuff you can use, that we really did have to get into supporting staff and working with them directly. So some of the next things we did are some digital badges, but just in relation to planning ahead, what we did with universal design that, and I'll come to it in a second, I certainly had been involved in that space for quite a while, and we were trying to look at linking this to the blended learning space and to digital tools. So I'm actually going to point you to a book here. Again, it's in with the resources from Katie Novak and Caitlin Tucker, that the UDL and blended learning gurus, that the way they've written about universal design in schools is in order to facilitate flexible landscapes. And this is something that's come up time and time again for us in working with staff, is because of the constant pivots and the constant uncertainty about, are we hybrid, are we face-to-face, are we disrupting learning, is learning not disrupted, that there does need to be some sort of oversight for educators that kind of goes beyond the single framework or looking at those design approaches as just very different things and trying to blend those together to some extent, so that, if you take a framework like UDL, it reminds us that the goal of school effectively is to teach students to become motivated and resourceful and innovative and let them be creative and prepare for their lives. But really, to do that, we have to embrace some sort of blended learning, so our practices can seamlessly traverse from those spaces, from in-person to hybrid to online and back again. And some would argue that, most learning does take place in the blended space anyway, partially because so much of our content, so much of our ways of communication, and so much of what even you folks are talking about in the chat before the session, indicate that learning is taking place to whatever degree in the blended space. So how we supported staff more specifically in terms of inclusion, in terms of digital skills, and in terms of that empathetic kind of level of support, is we offered, now there's more on offer, but to cut to it, we developed a digital badge and we also used another digital badge. So as a project team, we developed the Getting Started with Personal and Professional Digital Capacity open course that was in partnership with the National Forum. All these materials are actually openly available, so it doesn't matter what sector you're in. They're absolutely reusable and can be adopted for local use. So we developed that course and we used in our institutions the Universal Design for Learning course that was developed by the folks in HEAD and UCD. And again, those materials are available there. So what those courses really did, in the Universal Design for Learning course, we certainly rolled those out within the different institutions. I've done at NUI Galway now, I think 3 or 4 rollouts, and they were really, really popular last year. And I was very surprised, given how tired folks are, how overwhelmed our staff are. The uptake of those was just fantastic. And I'll come to, I think, why that was in a second, but moving into the online space probably contributed to that to some degree. And like I had said, we developed our own Getting Started with Personal and Professional Digital Capacity course that we actually rolled out as a project team across the institutions for a national rollout in November of 2021. So these short courses are that, they help to kind of build informal learning networks, because aside from the uptake, what the format is essentially a light touch kind of peer group format that staff work together. They're not content heavy, and they work to redesign an element of their teaching in around 25 different 25 effort hours across 6 weeks generally, although the timing can be changed up a little bit. And the materials are open access. But what we found that was really surprising was that the peer group format specifically was what really appealed to staff in both courses. And what it helped us to do at not only a national level but an institutional level was to see new communities, new informal learning networks start to grow. And in that comes sustainable change when you start to see these networks come out of CPD events. So we actually just evaluated our own getting started with personal and professional digital capacity course. And I know that's a bit of a mouthful. So we do tend to use an acronym instead, but that's a mouthful too, to be honest. So what was interesting is because the National Forum badges run for higher ed and further ed, we had about 20 different institutions, represented in the folks that partook in the course, but we also had 7 universities and 6 ETBs, which was lovely to see staff working across the sectors together in very mixed peer groups from very different settings, but working to support each other. And again, I've posted all these resources, but well, it was no surprise to us whatsoever that folks said they had a hard time finding the time to complete the course, because we know that time and time again. But that 68% said that learning from their peer triads was their favorite part of the course. And that's overwhelming feedback. And when we received the same feedback at NUI Galway for local rollouts of these courses, that staff wanted the assurance of working together. They want the assurance of working with people like us that work in staff development that can empathize and support. And they want to make small changes to their teaching and receive some sort of verification. And the digital badges actually work really well for that. So the other piece, if students are at the core of our work, was listening to students. And this research we completed as a student campaign on social media is actually fascinating to pore over in your own time, that these are students that were 18 plus. We put out the survey in April through May of 2021. The results are interesting because they really support this, I suppose, the approach of this talk about flexible and inclusive learning. That what it indicated was that, students do want to be on campus. They do want to be with each other, not all the time. That you'll notice that, maybe 1 to 3 days a week was the majority of the research there. They do want their lectures recorded. They do want, things to be online, but they maybe want to be mostly on campus. They do their work at home as much as they do on campus. Strongly in favor of open book assessments, but assessment did change for us in this sector as well, that things became much more flexible. My favorite piece of this is that, yes, students wanted some flexibility and they want materials online. But if you look at this slide, there's some overwhelming in favor in terms of engaging with people on campus, like we're talking about earlier, in the lead up to this, to the conference, that seeing each other's faces, that they want to see other students, they want to engage with lecturers, but they do want that flexibility in those splits between lectures being online, tutorials being online, that they certainly have noticed that flexibility was used. And why wouldn't it continue to be used? And of course, each sector has its own issues. We face in the cities, housing crisis and students that are dealing with lengthy commutes or caregiving responsibilities. And there are so many barriers to higher ed anyway. And I'm sure you can think of your own students that are going on, with their lives and when they finish school, thinking about those barriers they might face, that, what a shame it would seem to not offer some flexibility to students. So as I start to kind of round up here, that this slide troubled me a little bit because frankly, what are our project takeaways? The project will end in September. So we do have a few more months on it. We're in the process of reviewing it at the stage that we're getting into that. There's no formal kind of findings at this stage, but certainly what we've learned, that those of us on the project team working on the ground, that really from this work, from talking to students, from our close work with staff, is that certainly we've always adhered to the ethos of a student-centered vision, that we listen to students, we have student interns, that we, on the project team, on the national team, we have student interns working with us closely within the different institutions. That's always been at the heart of that, was listening to our students. But with staff, this really surprising element of how peer learning through either formal or informal networks has shaped their practice during a very difficult time, and during a time when they really were seeking collaborative opportunities, seeking a sense of community. And we found that through webinars, through our mailing list, through the Twitter chat, and mirroring what has happened in CESI all along. And I think what was really important to me as I was kind of reflecting on this work and reflecting on what CESI kind of offers is, these models, they're applicable across the sector. And, it maybe took a funded project for us to learn what was there all along in different communities. But it's great to evidence that this works, because we do see this need from staff to work, with others, not necessarily even for formal credentials. I teach a 10 ACTS module on learning technologies, and yet I see more engagement with the open courses and digital badges than we do with staff that want that formal learning opportunity. And that we have to be flexible. So those badges, when they moved, that they had to be, I suppose, when so they moved, they had to be offered online and not in, a workshop space. That flexibility just allowed people to engage. And I know we do want some face-to-face coming back into the play, but we never would have had those numbers. And we have to be aware of that within the institutions, that we never would have had the engagement we did if we didn't have flexible opportunities. So as I end, I would just say that, my catchphrase as a teacher was always that I am cautiously optimistic, that when things were going awry on me, that students would note that I said that entirely too often. But, I am cautiously optimistic that, we've been through a terrible couple of years. There are things happening in the world that, frankly, that are affecting us, and we are cognizant of our colleagues abroad. But, coming to something like this today, and like I did 10 years ago, it does offer hope, because it's a space to talk, a space to connect, a space to reflect, a space to, run ideas past each other and get some of that assurance that, that we often seek. And there's some fantastic work out there. Laura Chernowich and these collaborators on this paper, she's from the University of Cape Town. They've done fantastic work kind of looking at equity in terms of online learning, pre-pivot, post-pivot, around open educational resources and access. But what I love about the work that, can highlight some vast inequities is she always offers a glimmer of hope in those communities and in things that have transpired. So in this paper, again, the resources are linked. She just notes that out of all of this, the pandemic has managed to bring into focus examples of extraordinary resilience, networks, and at times unexpected alliances of collaboration and support, including inspiring creativity, examples of technology used for equity purposes, and frankly, moments of optimism. And I think that's probably in line with a lot of the work you're going to see here today, folks. You're going to see, technology responding to all of the issues, that teachers were facing, that you're going to see so much creativity, you're going to see the collaboration and support, and hopefully you'll see some of those moments of optimism. So I'm just going to highlight one resource, because you're going to have a little bit of a homework to do after this talk. One interesting resource that I've followed, and actually that paper would have appeared in as a preprint, was this collection out of the University of Manchester that focuses on the post-pandemic universities. So there's just a nice collation of resources. It's an online magazine, podcast, blog, that kind of thing. It's an interesting resource to check out, with all these different visions of what the university might look like post-pandemic. But it actually got me thinking, when I was doing a bit of rooting around for this project, or for this talk, was, based on today, based on reimagining what, teaching and learning might look like, we have all the collective intelligence in the room. You don't need me to be the voice of this. What does the post-pandemic school look like? That, what, based on all the talks you'll hear today, based on your own experience, based on all the reflections taken away from this trying experience that, none of us thought we'd be facing in our careers, that what do you think the post-pandemic school looks like? So what I've done, and I'm watching my time, is I'm just going to pop into the chat. I have a Wakelet of my resources, but there's also a Padlet there. And in that Padlet, I would invite you throughout the day, and I'll post it up again from time to time, when I'm in the background, is just to jot down some of your thoughts. I think I've set it up where it's anonymous, and do share, because I think the collective intelligence here is so vast. And for folks that maybe are new to the community, I don't know how many new folks are here today. You're in for a treat, because there's not only a wealth of knowledge, but there's a wonderful welcoming community. So Adrienne, that's why I wanted to focus slightly more on my project, because I think a lot of what we've learned as a collective in terms of our collaboration across the institutions and how we supported staff during this period, I think those models of how we've worked together are probably the most vital of all, and maybe tying back into that approach of pedagogy first and care first. So I would end on some cautious optimism, but invite you to contribute there. And I'm watching my time, so I would say thanks for listening. I hope that was interesting in any sort of way, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I mean, the optimism is just oozing out of you, to be quite honest, Katie, and so much from that project just is so full of hope, as you say yourself, both from the collegiality that peers found that approach worked so well, from the students who actually want to be on campus so much and to be face to face, because the story, the general narrative can be quite the opposite at times. And I think that there are times when things just come together, and by the sound of it, for your own project, the idea that it moved online and the project then became closer because it facilitated a better collaboration, and it's a real insight into how the medium we work in here can do that. So thank you very, very much for that. I would really only have time for maybe one or two questions at this stage before we move on. If somebody wants to. I think there's an awful lot to be had in that. I think you did share, it would be shared with us, didn't you, Katie?
Yeah.
Presentation.
Yeah, so there's a Wakelet there with all the resources, and the Padlet I would invite you to maybe have a go at throughout the day. Maybe we can peek back in on it at different times throughout the day and see what the collective intelligence is. I didn't want to focus on too much of the school of the future, because I was a bit tired at this stage, but just thinking about it all. No, I'm happy. I'll pop into the canteen, or I can catch up with any folks on Twitter either later.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Normal course events, big round of applause. So if your mic is on, fantastic, well done. And I think you've got start. So what happens now is that we'll come out of this room and the options will appear for the rooms 1, 2, 3, and 4, 4 being the cantina. So I'm